and welcome to Saga Saturday. Today we are talking about, we're kicking off Gender January with gender, never heard of her, early Scandinavian concepts of gender. So I am Ulla Brenna's daughter, a self-professed Norse nerd, and I am joined here with my much more esteemed and knowledgeable colleagues, also big old nerds. So if you, Bersi, why don't you kick off with your introduction?
Yeah, my name's Bersi Edvarðarson. I have a degree in Old Norse, and I haven't studied gender very formally, but as a trans person, I think I know a thing or two about gender, so I'm really excited about this month.
And I'm Dan Kinehild, the library. I have actually done a little bit of medieval gender studies, but only a very little bit. I was telling my co-hosts just before we started that I have been hauling around this class notes from a class I took in college called Women, Power, and Society in the Middle Ages with Dr. Kathleen Kamrick. And I am really excited that hauling this around all these years has finally paid off, because now I get to sit here with these wonderful people and be like, okay, let's talk about Galenic theory. So there's going to be diagrams later. Look forward to that. And otherwise, I did not come into this with a lot of Norse background. For me, it was Old English, and the history of England was my original area of focus. But in doing Saga Saturday, I have developed a keen interest and awareness for all of this craziness, even though, as we will discuss in February, the English are better. So,
Fighting words.
So hang on one second. I'm not 100% sure we're actually streaming.
No, we totally are.
Are we? Okay.
Live. Yeah.
Oh. Fantastic. Excellent. Are we streaming in the event or in the Saga Saturday page?
I think we're in the event.
Oh, yes, it is. Okay. Sorry, Facebook is dumb. All right, cool. All right, so with our introductions out of the way and confirmation that we really are streaming, I sometimes hate the Facebook Zoom interface, we will kick this off. So, Bersi?
Yeah, so to, as the person who suggested that the month be this theme, I've sort of become the de facto guide through gender topics, which is great because I'm woefully unprepared. I very quickly threw together a little slideshow so that I could help keep my thoughts in order, and also pull out some very pertinent quotes, probably way too many quotes, that could help us sort of get a better idea of just an overview of the concepts of gender and sex in early medieval Scandinavia, because gender is complicated enough in the modern day. It's very complicated when you look back in time so far, and oftentimes people try to apply modern concepts of gender to historic people. This often falls through in many different ways, because we assume oftentimes in modern culture that gender is this unchanging set system that is innate in everybody, and clearly through various movements and studies, we're complicating even that in the modern day. But so let's take a look back at the Scandinavian concepts of gender. Why are they different? Where do they diverge? And a couple of terms that really highlight this. So we looked at the, I'm sharing my screen, here we go. So this, we looked primarily at an article by Carol Clover called Regardless of Sex. It's got a longer title, actually. I don't know where it was. Scrolling back up to the top of my article. So
that, Men, Women, and Power in Early Medieval Northern Europe.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
And we'll have the full title and citation in our in the YouTube version, and we can post it in the group.
Yeah, so I'm going to do my best to sort of summarize what I think are the main points of this article. And I'm just a me, so, you know, if you pulled out different things from this article, great, good. So there are two terms that are really the focus of this article. Carol Clover looks specifically at the term blauder and the term vater. These are the Cleesby Vigfusson translations of these words, the definitions here. So we've got blauder properly means soft, weak, answering Latin mollis, and is opposed to vater, brisk or vigorous. Metaphorically, blauder means feminine, vater meaning masculine. But then there's this interesting distinction where when you're talking about animals, it actually can fully just give you the sex of the animal. And so like there's this weird divide. And so Cleesby Vigfusson doesn't really quite know what to do with this, like there's a metaphoric meaning as well as like a literal meaning, and it's kind of unclear and hard to tell. So you can see even with this definition, we've got modern scholars and translators having trouble figuring out exactly how to gender these terms. And then of course there's vater, which is the other term here, bold, active, vigorous, and male, as opposed to blauder, which is female. And then once again, of beasts. Things get confusing and weird, and Carol Clover really wanted to dig into that. What's going on with these two terms? So vater is sort of the masculine ideal of what you can be, and you know, just a shorthand, Viking society, we'll call it. Viking society would, of course, is a very patriarchal society. The emphasis is on masculinity, on men are the ones who tend to dominate the social and political and legal spheres. But there seems to be a lot of wiggle room. There's a lot of leeway between. So there's many examples in sagas and in legendary tales and in poems of women displaying vater qualities. So for instance, some of the ones that Clover discussed were Unnur in Djupudha, who is one of Iceland's founding fathers. There were, I think, 12 or 13 women who supposedly were in the first group of settlers in Iceland. Yeah, Kinehild?
So I was just going to say, folks may know her better as Ode the Deep-Minded. That's usually how her name is presented in English.
Right. Yeah, Djupudha, deep-minded. So Unnur, or Oath, the deep-minded, she's quite remarkable. She, fearing for her life and fortunes in Scotland after the death of her father and son, had a ship built in secret and fled, taking all of her kin and retinue with her to Orkney, then the Faroes, then finally to Iceland, where in about 900 she took possession of vast lands and established a dynasty. And so in every respect, as Preben Sorensen observes, she has taken over the conduct and social functions of the male householder and leader. And she's greatly praised for this. When she dies, she's in the saga, the author, says that she was a paragon of women. It is a good thing. It is a clearly positive thing to take on these vater, or masculine qualities. Auðr in Gisla Saga, so Gisli's Saga, has a very interesting scene in which she protects her husband, Gisli, who's been outlawed, from his pursuers, Eyjolf being the primary pursuer. Eyjolf, essentially, this scene, he's asking her, hey, where's your husband? And I'll pay you to show me where your husband is. And initially, she says she accepts these terms, carefully counts out each piece of silver and puts it into a purse. And then at the end, slaps him across the face, giving him a bloody nose with this purse full of silver. and shouts some abuse at him, saying, "You'll never find my husband," and, you know, "Screw you for even asking." And Eyjolf almost attacks her, saying that through this action, through her violence, she has, okay, well, if you want to act father, I'm going to treat you that way, right? A Norse man would be considered cowardly, or blauther, we'll get into that, if he were to attack a woman. But in this case, he's saying, no, because you just did that to me, you've put yourself in another category, and I'm going to attack you back. But Eyjolf's men say, no, 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 that's not true. She's still a woman. If you were to attack her, you'd be even more cowardly. Mm-hmm. And so pull him back. So there's clearly a lot of space to jostle around, and people can determine case by case whether or not someone is acting as a man or as a woman, or at least in these sort of terms is father or blauther. And then Freydis, whose name I did not correct the D into an ed here, but that should be an ed. Freydis from the Vinland sagas, who we talked about back when we were talking about the Vinland sagas, like her whole deal, like doesn't even matter which version of Freydis we're talking about, whether it's the axe murderer in the farmhouse or the bearing her breast and slapping it with a sword. Either way, that's definitely very father sort of actions. So these are just a few, and there's a lot more examples of Maykonger and shield maidens, and all these different women who are taking on masculine roles, and either being praised, or at the very least just sort of like, it just is what it is. Only every once in a while does the medieval author sort of deplore the woman for taking on these masculine roles because of her being out of her place or anything like that. So this sort of gender transgression is not just okay, but sometimes a praiseworthy thing, because father is truly a masculine ideal. Now, I've talked a bit about like this wiggle room that women seem to have, and I'd love if those who've read a bit more on the laws and things could, chime in here. But women's role in society, while rather, there are many roles in Norse society that were typically held by men and were, sort of codified in the laws and stuff as being, these are male roles. But that had a lot of, there were always exceptions to these rules, right? So in this case, as William Ian Miller puts it, women were more than mere title holders with managerial powers lodged solely with men when it comes to like leading the household, and I think it's my next. Yeah, so these are the different roles that male roles that could be held by women, though frequently they were not. So the office of Gothi, only men could be called Gothi, but the office could be owned by a woman, interestingly enough. It's like some weird, it's like
a weird loophole in the structure there.
Yeah. I would think of it like in the SCA as if someone like was like, I own the throne and the crown. I am not the king, but I own this position. I own this role. And one source says that women could bring up lawsuits and pursue their own lawsuits until they were debarred in 992. Usually men served as witnesses, but there were certain circumstances in which women needed to serve as witnesses. There was, and this is a quote from the article, at least one woman who was formally empowered by the disputants to act as arbitrator in a case. Usually arbitrators were men, head of household, as I discussed. Feud violence was usually something that was only supposed to affect men. Only men could be could be killed or injured in feuds. But there are several instances in which, in a list of able-bodied men, women are included as part of that, and part of the retaliation needed to be attacking these women as well as the men with them. And in Iceland, women could be subject to outlawry. Yeah.
So we also talked a couple episodes ago, but I wanted to remind folks about some of the Norwegian, mostly pre-Christian Norwegian law, the Gulatingslov. I don't speak Norwegian. So that stated that women could act as witnesses and swear oaths. Widows could travel to the thing and act in the place. And I did it again. It's Gulatingslov because ting is the thing. Okay, so yeah. Gulatingslov. You corrected me on this last time. Gulatingslov. So women could travel to the thing and act in the place of their dead husband. In some occasions, women could. The term they used is skjelavig, account for the legal implications of a felony that she had witnessed. The widow of a man who'd been murdered. So it was her duty to convene a thing at the site of the killing, and it's up to her to decide if a sentence should be passed there and then. Right. So this doesn't say that she is the one determining guilt, but it certainly implies strongly that if she determined that the guilt had been appropriately applied, that she could be like, and this is your... But in most of these cases, we'll note that it is a widow. As the footnote discusses on your slide, like the status of widow was a sort of explicitly more powerful status, which is something that we see continued on through the Middle Ages. Once a woman had reached widowhood, like you had additional legal powers. It gets a little tricky with children. So, right, like later on, things get a little bit more complicated. But once a woman had been married and her husband died, suddenly she has a different legal status than she had held at any other point in her life. And interestingly, it's something that you also see in Roman law.
It is, and it's not the same, from what I've seen, it's not the same amount of power as her husband would have had in that situation. No. It's kind of this step between the traditional female gender and the male gender roles. It's this like half step in between. And there is, and I've, through my readings, it seems that there's also a difference between pre-Christian and post-Christian. Once the, post-Christianity, it becomes more and more male dominated and more male, widows lose rights over time until they're kind of, chattel almost. But, and also the other things that I've found is that women are pre-Christian conversion, it was much more likely that the woman would stay in that widowed role. And even if that woman remarried, still seemed to retain a lot of that empowerment. Yeah. However, after Christianity, if the woman remarried or had, once she had adult male children, the expectation was that she would relinquish her empowerment to her new husband, to her adult children, adult male children, or maybe to a brother or something like that. So there's just so much that happened with the conversion to Christianity and the roles of gender and who did what. So.
I think two really good examples of sort of how marital status changes women's power, and it's not just whether or not you're widowed, right? So if you're unmarried, if you're maiden, right, you have the least power over your own life. And then once you're married, you've got a little bit more. You're probably running, if you've got the status of you've married the head of a household, and so you're kind of helping run things, right? You've got quite a bit of actual power there, and then once you've been widowed or divorced is another. So for instance, if you take a look at in Laxdæla Saga, we always bring up Gudrun, right? Gudrun's a very remarkable woman in many ways, one of which she had 4 husbands. Her first husband she divorces because she tricks him into wearing into cross-dressing, essentially into wearing a very low cut shirt that says it showed his nipples, and that's just such a silly thing to like, who's wearing in Iceland. And so she divorces him, and the thing is, before she got married, if someone came to her father and said, I'd like to, the typical courtship is you go to the person you want to marry first. So the man goes to this woman he wants to marry, and he says, hey, do you want to marry me? And she's like, oh, that sounds great to me, but you should go to ask my dad. And this is just like the standard thing. You should go ask my dad. And then, or my brother, if my dad's dead. And then he goes and asks, and then he gets actual permission. You could ask someone and they could be like, I don't really want to. And then you could still go ask the father. And then the father could be like, well, could either decide like, hey, that sounds like a great idea, you should totally do it even anyway. Or they could be like, no, actually, my daughter says she doesn't want to marry you, so no. This is where, but again, that power rests with the male family member. But after you've been married and you get divorced or widowed, you now have that power. And sometimes people would defer it just as part of standard. This is shown in I can't remember exactly which saga, but I remember noting it when I read it. I was like, oh, that's interesting. A divorced woman has accepted marriage from someone, and in that right rests solely with her, but she still says, you should check in with my dad anyway, just because it's part of the social norms. But once you've been, so Gudrun, after that point, she chooses all of her marriages, and she has far more power. And then outside of sort of marriage things, when it comes to feuds, a woman could sort of, and in the law code, it's phrased as act as a son, in terms of like inheritance and pursuing the correct sort of steps of feuding, of making sure that the proper weregeld is given back and forth, compensation is paid.
So this makes me think, and this is nothing that I have actually found, but maybe you have, because you have done more extensive reading on this. Have you found anything where a woman acts as a father in like arranging marriages or that sort of thing? I think that I've seen something where somebody asked the permission of mom because dad was dead, but now I can't think of where that was.
I have not encountered an actual example, or at least I can't think of one, but it is the case that I didn't include it in this point, but when it comes to, when I say control over children, that's the marriage status of for children. There's I believe in the article, Clover said like it implied that it was less control over that than other things, but that there was an amount of control that widowed women could have over choosing spouses for their children.
And it's worth noting, like in Loxdale Saga, Ode, she's not necessarily people aren't coming to her for permission to marry her children, but she's very actively like
matchmaking and
like
things up.
She is actively engaged in the marriage market, getting her children married off to the right people. So I don't know that part of sort of taking care of your children, governing your children's lives was entirely a masculine role, but like obviously she's stepping into part of that.
And there's I don't remember if I actually have the quote in here. Again, like I said, I have way too many quotes. But Clover does say like there's a big gap between the de facto and the de jure roles of women in this society. The things that are written into law, right? The de jure doesn't necessarily reflect accurately how women's influence actually got applied in society, right? Like you can say, oh, you have no power, but there's clearly a lot of social interaction and power happening outside of the law that very much has an influence.
And speaking as a mother, there is no way that I'm gonna let my child be married off to some heinous dude that just because dad thinks that's a good idea, right? Like, no, women still have power. It's just often behind the scenes. And it's not written about, and throughout history, all kinds of history and cultures, it's there, but it's not necessarily codified and written.
So something I'm hoping that we can touch on towards the end of today is you were talking about the feud cycle and women's role in the feud cycle. And I did look, and there's a little bit of discussion about in Clover about in the Grogus, you have the rings of relation. And so you're working out, but something else. So there is in the sagas a very clear role for women in the feud cycle, and that is pushing the feud forward. So the role of women as one of the articles I found talks about it as the whetter, the whetstone that sharpens the knife. So the female whetter. And that cold counsel of women where they're really kind of driving, like, it is your job to seek revenge. So that's an interest. Anyway, we were talking about feud cycles. That is sort of classically in the sagas, the women's role in feud cycles is to drive that cycle.
Yeah.
Like encourage, like you need to, I've got some great quotes that we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's encouraging the male to do their proper duties, and is that maybe because the woman it can't because of societal norms or laws, or is it just that it's the men are bigger and stronger? Who knows? But there's a lot of kind of, I don't want to say manipulation by women, but there's a lot of it's manipulation and button.
I would say manipulation.
It is. It really is. It just has such a negative connotation.
Manipulative. But yeah. All of these sort of concepts, though, all this wiggle room, I found that one quote I said I got about de facto and de jure status. So if all of these things, like if women were not, especially, as it says, seems not to have been especially hindered by notions of male and female nature, what is the gender system, right? So our wealth, prestige, marital status, and personality and ambition, if those are enough to overcome sort of the category of woman, right? Because again, we're talking about a society that places its highest import on masculinity. What does it say about the sex gender system in early Scandinavia? And what does that mean for maleness in early Scandinavia? So I have so much stuff. So let's get into it. Kinehild, you can bring out your diagrams, because we're going to talk about the one sex model. The one sex model. All right. So first off, just gender 101, sex and gender, different things. We're going to talk about gender is the social concept of sort of secondary sex features and gender roles, things like that. And then sex is like biological sex, which of course is more complicated than a binary also, but Galen didn't know that. Galen sure didn't know a lot of things. So I forgot the man's first name. Was it William? Thomas Lacour argues on the basis of the medical tradition that the one-sex model of sexual difference didn't fully yield to a two-sex one until the late 18th century. This is in Europe, with the invention of separate femaleness with its own organs and characteristics. So no one had a very good idea of a two-sex system until the late 18th century, according to Thomas Lacour. And so what Clover is suggesting, not I, this is Clover here, is suggesting is that there are one-sex systems, and this doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I know, I reread the actual article. That is what she wrote. I don't think that's what? I don't know.
Well, anyway, and that early Northern Europe lived a one-sex social logic, a one-gender model to a degree unparalleled elsewhere in the West. And that medievalization of the North entailed a shift of revolutionary proportions, a shift in the direction of two-sex thinking. So essentially, they're using what she's saying is they're using one sex logic and models, but kind of pointing towards a two gender system. And so that's why things are getting a little weird and wonky. And she's saying that specifically Scandinavian and the gender concepts in the North were different than continental concepts of gender at the same time. So not only has things shifted in time, but in space, there's already a division between those up in the North and those in continental Europe, due to things like Christianization at an earlier time, knowledge of Greek and Roman anatomical studies, things like that. None of my slides are in any dang order. So Kinehild, you have some models, I believe, to show us.
Okay, you got to turn off screen sharing though, so that this.
Oh yes.
Yeah, turn off your screen sharing so that
Yeah, there we go.
So let's start really quickly. Galen, ancient Greek. Now I should have looked that up. Anyway, so he had these theories. So we talk about Galenic theory, and this is something that actually is very pervasive in medieval thought. It's not just about gender, it's also about health and wellness and all this kind of stuff. And so you have hot and cold, and basically Galenic theory, as far as sex holds, is that there is sort of one model for sex, one model literally for genitalia. It's just on men it's right side out, and on women it's inside out. So this is a Galenic diagram of this is 16th century, but it's a diagram after Galen of the female reproductive organs, and it's not the model that you learn about in human sexuality anymore. So if we hold it that way, it's a little bit more obvious what it is. And this is the notion of the one sex system is basically that there really is just one, and you have the more perfect and the less perfect version. The more perfect version is the right side out version. The less perfect version is the inside out version. So really women are less perfect men. And that's the concept of the one sex system, is that there really just is the one, and you have the good version and the bad version. And because Galen was a dude, ladies were the bad version.
Well,
so that's,
and I gotta say, my thought on that is that he was wrong, because if anyone has ever seen a woman kicked in the, kneed in the crotch versus a man kneed in the crotch, there's a big difference. And I would argue that the female version is is stronger and more correct. I don't want to say correct.
I'm not gonna.
I totally want to say correct, because you don't want to get kneed in the jumbly bits. How can that be the right way to go?
It is not for
Sorry,
me to argue with Galen, but he was wrong. Clearly,
wrong.
We now have a much clearer understanding of the female reproductive system. And the other one that I wanted to say,
the only thing he was wrong about.
Yeah,
true fact.
Yeah. Let's be clear that there were many things Galen.
A lot of different laws.
As it turns out, it turns out, as we discovered later. Also, what's interesting is talking about 18th century revolution and understanding of the going from a one sex to two sex system. We've also got Da Vinci, and Da Vinci, he's got picture, he sketched out wombs and stuff. So he clearly there was an earlier medieval understanding of sort of the differences between the sexes. I don't understand enough. I've never read Lecure, so.
From what I know about Galen and his influence is that basically, so Galen, I looked it up when he lived and died so that we would have that. He was born in 129 AD and died in 210 AD. And his ideas stuck around way longer than normal. People were still using Galenic theory for all sorts of things. And this is also, Galen talks all about humors too, right?
Yeah, so that's what this is about, is you have hot up here and cold down here. So hot is male, cold is female. And then you have like the elements, and you have seasons on there, and like you hear mannish women, womanish men, and then hermaphrodites on the sides. And this, and like which of the humors controls or is influenced by what or influences what. And this is getting into the Galenic medical theory, which is like, if you are it's not just, I mean, it's physical health and mental health, right? So if you are
Right.
melancholic, that means that you have an excess of this particular humor, so you need to eat this kind of food, and that will cure, because that, like, if you are cold and wet, you need to eat hot dry foods to bring yourself into balance. It gets very complex, but if you're interested in medieval cooking, a lot of medieval cooking was influenced by Galenic theory. And so we're talking about how Galen influenced all sorts of stuff. Weird medieval food is coming off of the idea that you needed to bring your humors into balance, and to do that, you had to eat these types of foods.
Just like one of my favorite drinks, Hippocras. It is spiced wine. You take wet, cold wine and put hot, dry spices in it, and now you have a balanced drink. Every medieval person needs a good balanced breakfast. Keep their humors in check. Anyway,
right. And back to gender and
so you can see how things start getting very strange to a modern eye and a modern ear when we start getting into the gender systems, and like, okay, wait, there's only one sex, and women are just a less perfect or an inferior version of the male sex, and what and so if you have this idea that there's only one category really, and that it is more of what you do and what your actions and things, now we've got very mutable categories rather than I think in modern society, especially before much of the political advancements of rights for trans people and things like that, and really gender critical theory, we've got like these monoliths, this polarity between the two binary genders of like, if you have this, we have an idea of, if you have certain biological markers, you fall under a social category that cannot change. You must be, if you have a penis, you are a man. If you have a vagina, you are a woman. And there's a very clear divide. This is much less the case in this one sex system, right? Because you are just simply a less perfect version. And so this is where we get into this idea of Vater and Blauther being mutable and changeable categories. We've already seen many examples of women rising up into the Vater category. But men could just as easily, actually much easier than women, slip down into the Blauther category. So let me see if I can get back into screen sharing real quick, because I have some more quotes. So, all right. So, although the ideal man is Vater and the typical woman is Blauther, neither is necessarily so, and each can and does slip into the territory of the other. That's a quote from the article, but this is what I say. So, this is the root for what Clover calls the men's frantic masculinity, this constant need for men to prove themselves as honorable, as brave, as warriors, as people who don't cry, as people who have pretty much only the emotions that are encapsulated by like anger and violence, and that you have to constantly be proving yourself through your words and actions to be part of this category. Otherwise, you'll slip down into Blauther and be called cowardly. There's lots of emasculation. This is where Neith comes in really strong, but I'm going to save the discussion of Neith really for when we have a whole episode on it. And so, in addition to those things, there's this concept of umegi and magi, or megi. The prefix u, and in modern Icelandic that's an o, is a negation. It's like un. So magi or megi means oh, did I put it down? Yeah, like breadwinners. And umegth or umegi magi are dependents. Literally those who cannot maintain themselves. So children, aged people, men disabled by sickness, paupers, etc. So and when we talk about paupers here, we mean like literally if you're a dependent because you're too poor to support yourself. Whereas magi or megi, on the other hand, are breadwinners. So she suggests that this is the binary. Those who can rely on themselves and have these father qualities, and those who don't. Strong and weak, powerful and powerless or disempowered, swordworthy and unswordworthy, honored and unhonored or dishonored, and winners and losers. So in essence, I've divided out the difference between father and blauder. To be father, this is the typical category for men, but men don't all fall under this category. It is the ideal for all people, not just men. And it is characterized by being able-bodied, honorable, brave, not weak. You can sort of just keep going with those different, honorable can mean a lot of different things. That means you are pursuing feuds properly. You are, a generous leader. There are all sorts of like deeper cultural ideas of what honorable means. But to be father, you must be honorable. And blauder is everything else. It's the typical category for women. It's anything that fails to be father, anyone who is old, injured, or not able-bodied. And therefore, any man can be blauder simply by failing to be father. That was my crash course through the summary of the article. I know y'all had some other articles too that were interesting.
We do. You want to kill the screen sharing if we're done with this? So a couple of things on your last bit about kind of male roles, something that an article that I pulled, an interesting thing, and something that I think anybody that's read sagas before has noticed, that a lot of the sagas really have to do with very male pursuits, very, it's sailing, it's fighting, it's and it's really, there's so much dedicated to like bullying and boasting and competitive games and stuff like that. And that is definitely a male world, right? Like women, we kind of do it, but not to the extent, right? If you sit around any campfire and it is, I mean, even as a fighter, like I'll talk stick all day long, but I'm not going to do the same kind of hazing sort of thing that I think that most male gendered people do. So some of the things that I was looking at, I was actually looking at a great article called Ambiguously Gendered, the Skalds, Jorun, Adler, and Steinen. And again, there's just more information that gender could be determined by actions, not by genitalia. So men could become women by growing old, or being penetrated by another man, or they could, like in the case of Ref the Sly last week, he ran away from the polar bear to go get an axe, came back, the axe was killed by the cold neighbors, but then they became bullying to him and called him effeminate, and because he had run away from this fight. So because he wasn't strong enough. But women can become men by being assertive, doing pioneering acts, like settling Iceland, or settling Greenland, stuff like that. And whereas, just as you said, the woman to man transition is viewed as value neutral or even a positive, but a man to female, male to female, was not so much that. And actually, this is something I'm going to check with you language nerds on, because I am not language nerd. I was looking at, so Skaldmir is poet maiden, skaldic maiden. Heirdmir is court lady. Why is there a, so, and this article posits that Skaldmir is assumed to be young and unmarried, but Hildmir as a court lady does not have the same connotation. Those women could be married. So mare could connote an absence of sexual attachment, or maybe relatively gender neutral. I don't know, because I'm not a language nerd. I totally wanted to get your ideas on that.
So when we talk about translation from any language, any word that we're translating has what's called a semantic field. So it's the whole range of concepts that can be carried by that one word. And I don't know, I'm gonna have to let Bersi talk about this particular word, mar, but with any word, it can get very, very complicated, because you've got all these other ideas tied in. And so in this case, oh, good, we got a dictionary. Skald may be coloring mar, and
right,
maybe coloring mar. So we may be getting influences on both of those, from both of those proto-themes onto the deutero-theme, proto-theme meaning first chunk of a.
That's what I was wondering and kind of thinking, but you know, what does the being a court lady, does that assume that there's a married woman, you know, there with her husband in the court, or is that a standalone thing that someone could be a lady of the court without having a male associate? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. So I haven't really encountered the term Hirdmere around. Hird is just the retinue, right. But often refers to specifically, it's the retinue of the king or whatever. That is like the armored retinue, the
guard, the
girls, the ones who are actually going to be doing fighting. And so here the term Hirdmere, like I've never seen that before. And I'm interested in where it's coming up. Yeah, that's really interesting to me that
That's something I'm actually going to dig into more, because I don't know it. Because did you find? Okay.
And in Zoega, maid, girl, virgin, poetically, daughter. That's all it's got in here.
For mare.
Yeah, for mare, which, by the way, if you have seen, like, for instance, the term Maykonger, which we're going to talk about later, M-A or M-E-Y, is the same word. It's just declensions. So if you were seeing M-E-Y, anything, so May or Mayer or Meyer or anything like that, that's almost certainly this word. It just has some interesting value mutations going on when it's defined.
So something, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I did a quick Google search for Hirdmar, and I am finding almost nothing.
Interesting. Like I said, I've only seen that reference in this one article, and I didn't have enough time to dig into her references on where that came from. So, but I'm curious now, especially thinking of it in the context of shield. I'm going to dig into it more for shield maidens, because if the Hird is the guard fighting contingent, is this a guard lady? I don't know.
So I'm now at the Hird section of Zoega.
Okay.
And Hirdmere is in here, court lady. But then it goes right into, it gives me no extra information. It goes right into Hird Prester, the king's chaplain. But Hird, of course, it's a feminine word that doesn't really mean anything, but it is. A king's or earl's bodyguard, the king's men. And you could be more specific by saying Hird Leave to mean the king's troops.
Interesting. Okay.
It's like an army.
Right.
So yeah, not giving much more information from this.
Super helpful, but all right. So one of the more gender mutable characters is, as we've talked about, is actually there were several Alders. This is Breach's Alder, described as neither beautiful nor hardworking, so just kind of average Jane here. She owned land on her ancestral farm, lived there with her brothers and husband, which is an interesting thing because it's noted that like she is part of this land ownership. And she's accused of wearing pants with a gore in the crotch, and that was grounds for divorce at the all thing, naughty, naughty, naughty. So just the same way that what's his name with the low cut shirt, I can never
and it's well, it doesn't matter what his name is.
It doesn't matter what his name is. So
this is the same. This is in the same series of events. Literally, Gudrun divorces her husband,
yes,
because she didn't like him by doing this thing, and then meets another man and is like, "Hey, I really like you, but your wife is known as Breach's Odd. Did you realize that? Maybe you should divorce her." Right. Under the same grounds.
Under the same grounds, which I think that's an interesting little plot twist there. But then so I'll definitely, so she is divorced. Her husband declares divorce at the thing. But that doesn't seem to actually impede her much, right? She still owns her land. She's overstepping the traditional social codes, but is still admired. And still, it's still a positive thing that she's like, I'm going to go do my thing. And then after the divorce, she goes into his bed chambers and cuts his sword arm and slices his nipples. Like she's got some things going on there.
She injures him pretty bad. And the saga notes that he never fully recovers from these injuries.
Exactly. Yep. Never fully recovers.
But that also, interestingly, she didn't get in very much trouble for this. This wasn't like retaliated against very much. And this to me seems to be both because even though she's cross-dressing, she's doing all these manly things, she's still being kept in the category of a woman or a Blauther, that she cannot be retaliated against. You can't have a feuding structure against her. And also because in the saga, they say she has now taken adequate revenge.
Yes.
Right. Like the husband, the guy who gets cut, the ex-husband, he's like, you know what?
I deserve that.
That's fair.
Right.
And
So
she
keeps, it's an interesting thing because she keeps her female status, but she also gets some like leeway.
Right.
Leeway. That's leanway. That's totally where I was headed there. So she gets that leeway to do these acts as a man without retaliation that a man would get in the same situation. So that's kind of a beautiful sweet spot that, you know, it's to balance it. And then, go ahead, Ken.
I was just really briefly, there is a GIF out there on the internet of this hockey player who's been put in the penalty box. And
oh my God, I just saw that today.
Right, he's like, this is bullshit. And then he watches the replay and he's like, okay, that's cool. Anyway, that's what was playing through my head.
I just saw that GIF this morning, and it is, as a hockey fan, it just cracks me up. Like, oh yeah, no, totally, I totally deserve that one.
Yeah.
So there's another reference of I'm totally gonna butcher her name. I'm guessing it's Thorhilder. Married woman, described it as a great troll with words, presumably causes discord with her tongue. Like she incites and pushes buttons, right?
Sounds like Sather to me.
Right? She's not, but it's not a positive connotation. Whereas Aud like does manly things and that's all cool. So, but she does this Thorhilder, if I could get my things. Is it because her, she also does manipulation and manly things, but it's not as positive? Is it more because it's more kind of shit stirring? Also, she's not a landowner. So how much of that ownership and that manliness comes with the land ownership that Alder has that Thorhilder doesn't?
This is linking to this concept of clovers where it's like, it's not just gender, it's your wealth, your prestige, your status, your marital status. Like, these are the things that are truly like, these matter. And the gender stuff kind of comes secondary. Whereas I think very much more like in the 20th century would absolutely come first. That you're, you know, and in this case, like, this seems to me she's taking on a role that's very much like the typical like witch in a story, and that's always a negative, right?
Always
like,
a negative.
The powerful words, that feels very much like you're doing incantations, you're doing chants, you're doing, even if you're not actually, it's being implied that you're doing witchy, feminine and dark magic.
Dark magic, the wily sort of,
which at the, you know, pre-Christian wasn't really, so that term dark magic gets applied to it later, and sort of like it's the devil's work. But at the time it was still not a, it was still a negative thing. It wasn't a, you know, it's a magic is a way to get your ends met through trickery and treachery, and not facing your problems straight on like a man.
Exactly. It's the behind the scenes manipulation, as opposed to the outright, I'm walking around in men's clothes cutting off arms, right? And then the last, this is so Steinen, another female skald. So as you mentioned earlier, Gothiship, chieftaincy it could be an inherited thing, and women could inherit sort of skaldic. The skalds also were often an inherited thing. You come from a skaldic family. So Steinen's father was also a skald. She just kind of took it up. But she specifically kind of acts as a man among men. She's a man's man. All of her writing topics are from the male realm. It's sailing, shipboard life. And she's one of the few the only female writer so there's references to women on shipboard going west to settle Iceland, to settle Greenland, to the Americas. She was one of the few that went east and went to Norway, and instead of, you know, so that's definitely a man's world. Like, and she was a good, again, positive. It wasn't a negative connotation. She was just kind of a man's man. She went sailing. She did her thing. But there's none of that dark magic, none of the bad juju associated with that. So those were kind of some of the things that I wanted to highlight. And then I know you've got a whole bunch to say.
Well, not a whole bunch, but first I wanted to say, I wanted to suggest that sometime in the future we do an episode on female skalds.
Yes, I would love
on the female skalds, and because I know there's another really good article out there called Never in Public, which is talking about female skalds. We've got a couple books on it. Like I think that would be a very interesting topic in the future. So I am suggesting that now. So what I wanted to talk about though was anger and gender. I found this great article by George Manning called "Is Rage Ever Permissible? The Gender Contingent Boundaries of Anger in the Islandasögur." So something to keep in mind is this is ranging not just the family sagas, but also looking at some of the chivalric sagas. So this is pushing 14th, 15th century. So this is not just the early stuff. This is all of it. So the first character he highlights is Skarpheiðin in Burnt Njál's saga, where he talks about, so Skarpheiðin says, he and his brothers, do not have the disposition of women that we may become angry over everything. So what, with that quote, what Manning is trying to highlight is that there's this sort of notion in old Icelandic literature that women are full of anger, and that they become angry at many things, that they burn very hot, right? Whereas men are supposed to kind of keep their emotions under control. There's supposed to be a temperance of emotion. And if we think back to Havamal does talk about, like, you need to keep guard over yourself, keep your emotions in check. Don't let people see, because if they see, then, you know, you might let something away. You need to keep it, to quote Ballif, right? Keep it secret, keep it safe.
Yeah.
You know, So men are expected to behave, or maybe the way not to talk about this is men and women, but people who are hvatar should be controlled in their emotion, whereas people who are blauðr don't have that control. They aren't capable of maintaining that control. So Skarphéðin here is like, we aren't like the ladies. We don't get mad over everything. But then we have examples like Bergthor in the same saga, where she is angry, and she says to her children, Gunnar, or her husband, no, her children, Gunnar, Hallgerðr's husband, grew angry on your behalf. So here she's like, you guys failed to get appropriately angry and take the appropriate action. So she's chiding them for failing to demonstrate this, what we might consider more blauðr ideal, being angry, but maybe it's more that they didn't become angry at the appropriate time. So there's a correct anger and there's an incorrect anger, and they failed to demonstrate correct anger, whereas Skarphéðin is talking about that incorrect anger, that just sort of constantly boiling madness, which, to be fair, if I was stuck in a sod hut with a bunch of people and animals, I would eventually just get mad. There would be like a base level angry. Like I've been in some of those reconstructed farmhouses, and if I was stuck in there, if it like this time of year, January, there would just be like a base level angry. Like, you, excuse me, you did what to my skier? You're gonna go sit outside.
Yeah.
Till I let you come back in, right? Like,
and that's something that we've touched on in the past about the roles and the social norms and well, if you do this, then I have to do this, and if you do that, I have to do this, right? So and if you don't respond appropriately, then that you get into trouble for that, or there's issues with not responding appropriately. So yeah, men, that you're not supposed to be angry all the time like women, but you're supposed to rise up and be angry when you're appropriately angry,
right?
Like when your neighbor steals your cow, right? It's so if you're not angry when your neighbor steals the cow, then your wife is going to get angry because the wife has a higher boiling point already.
And as we've mentioned before, it is often the role of women in sagas to be the wetter, the goading on of men into action, into doing proper, honorable action.
Right. So the verb that this saga uses with both Bergthora and Hallgerðr, another woman, is geisa, Geisa, which implies a goading capacity. We're going to the dictionary.
I need to get a copy of that.
It's online too. You can download a copy. But it's got this, we talked about that semantic field. It's got a semantic field that has more of a like encouraging to action, goading kind of thing. So go ahead.
Sorry, no, what did you, Geisa?
Yeah, Geisa. So while he's looking that up, I'm going to talk also about Grettir and Grettir's saga. We have a quote, only a slave takes vengeance immediately. So again, when we think about that hvatar blauðr dichotomy, and we talk about people who are not the breadwinners, right? A slave falls in that, he's a dependent. A slave is a dependent, it's in that blauðr category. And again, a blauðr fails to take right action, and he just lets his anger or her anger carry her away into wrong action instead of focusing and honing that anger into right action and controlling it. Nope, we're still looking. Okay, so Gisla's saga.
No, I found it, but okay. All I've got is geis, feminine noun meaning impetuosity. Geisa is a verb meaning to rage, be furious. So, and then it's been translated from Thera of si geisar hot. That's a quote from something. Their insolence runs high. So it's being translated as insolence, impetuosity, rage, fury.
All right. Well,
I'm looking at other words around it, and I'm not seeing, or other words that sort of include it, and I'm not seeing anything that really specifically talks about that. But I have a feeling it's probably just through context. It is often used in the sense of what you were saying.
So There's a maybe. So Gisla's Saga, we talked a little bit about Gisla's Saga earlier. In Gisla's Saga, Refr directs his fierce-tempered wife, Alfdis, to rage wildly and abusively to prevent Gisli's pursuers from finding him. So this is sort of like the directed missile version of anger, right? So Alfdis gets absolutely mad and crazy, and Refr just sort of points and fires. And her rage emasculates Gisli's pursuers, because here she is, it's kind of right action rage at this point, right? So this is the right rage. She's protecting the hero of the story. And so she takes correct action against her pursuers. Her pursuers then are being attacked by somebody who would otherwise be considered Blauder, and therefore they take on this sort of Blauder aspect themselves, and she takes on the Vater aspect, and they leave empty-handed, and they feel Mikin Manskava, great shame. I'm assuming Mikin is related to Mikkel, which is the Old English word meaning large or great, which shows up all sorts of places.
Mikkel also is the word in Old Norse as well. It's just a different declension in this case.
That's not a false friend. It's a real friend.
It's a real friend.
And Gisli himself, who was left cowering in the bed, which Manning identifies as an undoubtedly sexualized locus, right? Like we hear women described both in Old Norse and Old English poetry as sort of these bed companions, right? Like the brave warrior gets his bed companion. So the bed has this very sexualized connotation. So Gisli is cowering in the bed while Alfdis is lying on top of him and valiantly protecting him. And so by doing this, not only are Gisli's attackers emasculated, but Gisli himself is in this Blauder sphere. So here Alfdis, despite being wildly angry, which we might otherwise consider sort of Blauder because she doesn't have control over that anger, is Hvater because she's brave and
protective and yeah, yep,
she has
taking right action,
right,
honorable, correct action. It's yep, doing the things she's supposed to be doing if she were men.
So we did talk already about the female wetter motif, the cold counsel of women, very common motif in Old Norse literature, that whole notion, cold is the counsel of women, which is this great quote that appears at least in one saga, probably more than one.
I think it's in a couple, yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, cold is the counsel of women. So anyway, that's my, when you go to ask women for their opinion, remember cold is the counsel of women. I love that. It makes me happy. So there's an example that he points to for that, where you have Hyverviga Saga. One of the characters, Thurir.
So Thor, like Thor, right? Thor.
Right. Thor. Either.
Thurir. Yeah. Rages to mobilize her sons to avenge their brother's slaying. And the verb that gets used here is iskra, which translates as to roam, foam, or screech with rage. So I have been iskra. I'm sure other people have experienced that verb as well. That is, it's an experience.
To foam with rage. I've totally been there.
Think back to how you were feeling on election day in 2016. Yeah. Like there's a good definition for that verb. So the last character, the one that he really gets into, Manning really gets into, is this character named Olaf from Viglundar Saga, which is that one of those later sagas. This is a chivalric saga. It's dated to the 14th, maybe 15th century. So this is a solidly late medieval expression of northern concepts, right? So in this story, there's a whole bunch that happens in this story. It's really a love story between two completely unrelated characters. There's just this one incident that happens, right? So in the incident, we have Olaf and her husband, whose name I don't remember. So
Thorgrimr.
Thank you. So Olaf and Thorgrimr. So Olaf, Einar, character number 3, Einar is jealous of Thorgrimr's status and position, and did I get mixed up?
Second, I just wanted to clarify that This is Olaf with an O. It's two O's, and that's a woman's name. And then we are talking about a woman named Olaf, not a man, just to clarify.
Yes.
So it's not confusing.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know how to pronounce. I can't hear the pronunciation difference. So Olaf. That makes me feel better. So Olaf, Lady Olaf, has a husband, Thorgrimr. Einar, dude number 2, is jealous of Thorgrimr's respect. So the respect that Thorgrimr commands. So he decides that he is going to provoke Thorgrimr into vengeance, into losing control of his anger by raping Olaf. So, however, Olaf learns of these plans. And she says, I don't like this. This is not my jam. So she goes to her maid and she dresses her maid up in her own clothing. And then she dresses herself in what's described here as blue-black clothing, which we talk about. Blau.
Yeah, blau.
Yeah.
So we'll talk. I think we've talked about it in the past. I'm sure we'll talk about it again in the future. Blau has a bunch of information packed into that word. So it doesn't just mean sort of blue or black. It also, it's like when you commit killing, you typically wear blue, right? Like
Saga describes the color blau as being the color of bruises, which I think is a very fun way to put it. And yeah, like almost every time someone goes out to go kill somebody, if they mention clothes, like the only times anyone ever is mentioning specific clothing in sagas is usually like he was wearing a shirt of scarlet, which just means not necessarily red, but very fancy. Or they're wearing a tunic or a cloak that is blau, and it means I'm out for fucking death. You know?
Yeah, it's a dark. Yeah, it's not just a dark color; it's a dark connotation and the imbuement. Yeah.
So Olaf dresses her maid up as Olaf, and she herself dresses in this blau tunic. And as Einar comes into the room and sees the maid sitting there and goes to seize her and do his dark deeds, Olaf steps in, sword drawn, ready to go. And the saga notes that the man was not very big, but he had an extremely angry appearance. And they asked him what he was called, and he said that his name was Otar. So now Olaf has disguised herself as Otar. And what's interesting is the saga switches the gender of the pronouns. So when it's referring to Otar, it's using han, which is the masculine pronoun, not hun, the feminine pronoun. And so all of a sudden, like clearly she's not completely disguising herself. It does comment on her small stature, or his small stature, right? Like it's very much the aren't you small for a stormtrooper moment. Literally. But it's so she doesn't take on any of the masculine qualities of size or physicality, but and she is very angry, but it's right directed anger and all this kind of stuff. And so she steps in, she defeats, chases off Einar, and goes through a chunk of the story as Otar. And then eventually, when Otar is revealed to be Olaf, Olaf doesn't lose any quality. So there's no, despite having sort of slipped from stepped from the Blaudar sphere into the Hotter sphere, there's no negative connotation on this. And so when she sort of throws back the curtain and shows off who she is, she's still described as beautiful and stunning and gracious, and she's called the Radiant, the most beautiful, all this kind of stuff. And so there's no negative notion that she's gone the other way, and there's no real slippage back into Blaudar. She's not suddenly picking up these negative adjectives. It's what we might today consider very feminine adjectives, though I might note that like Olaf the Peacock from Loxdale Saga is also described as beautiful and fancy, right?
Right.
But he's, yeah.
These and the thing is, to me, being called like beautiful and these other things isn't necessarily pointing towards Blauther at all. It is just positive, and that her also, sorry, my brain's going too fast. The this links in really well with something that I want to talk about much more in depth when we get to the Mekonger, of this idea of what happens when specifically a woman has like fully like disguised or otherwise taken on like fully the role of a man in the story. Pronouns of this narrative have changed. Those around her are either unaware or do not care of her origins. And then there's usually a point in the story at which there's a flip back, with Mekonger or with Valkyries, like the absolute pinnacle, typical Brunhild, or the German version, Brynhildr or Brunhilde, if you're more familiar with Wagner. She's a Valkyrie and she has all these masculine qualities, and then she gets married and immediately goes back to, well, Brynhildr takes on a very special role because of her thing as a Valkyrie, but most of these women will then immediately go right back to sewing and doing embroidery, and I'll put the sword away now that I'm married. And that's like a very key turning point, is getting married and like getting like, in this case, sort of revealing herself, like, I haven't, I took on this role for these reasons.
So
interesting.
The last little bit I wanted to talk about with this story was that at the end, Olaf's husband doesn't grow angry. He doesn't want to take vengeance against Einar, because his argument is that, well, Einar didn't get what he wanted, so what vengeance is there for me to take? And he doesn't want to compromise his friendship with Einar's father, Holmkel. But the author of this article and another author, Evans, both kind of argue that in this case, Thorgrimr becomes Blauther, because he fails
to take the correct societal actions. That's really so much of it comes down to the appropriate societal actions for whatever it is, right? And that's as much determines gender as anything else, I guess, genitalia. Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I got on anger and
love it. Gender. Awesome. Well, we are a little over time. Sorry about that, everybody. But I think we've had a fantastic discussion. This is, I'm loving you guys. I love Nerd Saturday. So we're going to wrap up for today, unless you guys have any closing thoughts. We're going to spend all of January on gender. So next week, Saturday the 16th, 11 o'clock, we will be talking about shield maidens, Valkyrie, fighting women, as we've touched on a little bit here today, but we'll be all hour and a whatever on fighting women, and we will hopefully see y'all there. All right, have a great Saturday, everybody. If you're enjoying West virtual 12th night, also on Tier virtual 12th night is today. An FYI, the first Crown tournament since March happened yesterday in Lohawk, and because they have better control and restrictions on things. So there were 11 combatants in the tournament, and I've already forgotten the name of the winners. They are not people that I knew. It was a Roland and a Tulia. I totally butchered her name. I'm sorry. But anyway, so it is good to see a little progress in the SCA world that it's not a virtual event. It was lovely to see pictures of people actually at an event. So we'll get there eventually. But in the meantime, we have nerding to do. We will nerd out again next Saturday. Bye, everybody.
Bye.